Before I start, I'll be reading a paper, and I just want to make a point that we somehow have been a lot of sociologists and anthropologists today in Cairo have been turned through this revolution into the kind of photo reporters by default, if you want to, because you happen to be in the streets, and it is a visual revolution, definitely. And the impact of having, I mean, we all go to the streets with cameras, and as if it becomes a compulsive issue to have a camera with you. So, and to learn how to quickly take pictures or run or move swiftly. So that is one major point I want to make. The pictures I'll be showing today are definitely related to my talk, but the way I'm going to proceed is just let the slideshow run. And these pictures I have taken, they are basically all taken in Tahrir Square and in one major street which I'm doing research. I've been doing research in the past 2.5 years. The street of Mohammed Mahmoud, which is one of the major streets that is leading to the square. It is coincidentally the street that triggered the 1919 revolution and the street that has the entrance of the American University in Cairo. So this is one of the reasons why I also end up going there. And this street has turned to be, it has been nicknamed the street of the eyes of the revolution, because in 2011, November 2011, there was a massacre that took place between police forces and the revolutionary. 2012, the pictures you'll be seeing are revealing the fights, the repetition of the same encounter in 2012 as a commemoration of the 2011 massacre. And it turned to be also the street where graffiti artists decided to conquer it and to occupy it as one way of protesting, and at the same time as one way of being there, defending the street against, at that time, 2011, the Muslim Brothers, and 2012 was a different story, but once again, claiming that this is their street, and in some of the pictures, I'll be explaining that later, it clearly states no for the Muslim Brothers. The graffiti, part of my study will be really studying graffiti, but it's not only graffiti, it's studying the interaction between that street, the people of daily life of that street, and the graffiti, and the then walls that have been created later on. So I'll be running now the slideshow and be reading the paper. And just as a start, just to give you an idea, this is the open air museum this is the center of the square. This picture was taken in November during the time of the issuing of the constitution, when Morsi decided to rewrite and issue a constitution that was very much contested. And that museum is a museum commemorating all the martyrs and the victims. And the idea is it's an open museum where people write any kind of comment, wishful thinking, deposing flowers, or pictures of the missing. One of the most important things is that this revolution produced a lot of missing victims, and leading to families searching for them in morgues. There are more than I think 1,000 people missing, which reminds us really a lot of what happened in Latin America, Argentina at a certain point. So one way of remembering and evoking the missing is that kind of once again display. And that museum has been replicated in several other places. The Tahrir Square idea of open air museums has been then replicated in the presidential palace where Morsi then was ousted in July. So I will now run the slideshow and start my lecture. So the occupation of public spaces as an emerging global form of political activism witnessed a novel turn since the marking year of 2011. We are reminded by Oikonomakis and Roos that the second part of 2011 in the second part, the planet witnessed protests in more than 1,000 cities, amounting to 80 countries. This is what they claim. So the occupying square movements, much inspired by the moving images of the Arab Spring, replicated patterns by squatting public spaces. The tent became an international icon, and artistic expressions and new urban ways of action traveled swiftly, evidently though with a variety of local divergences. Oikonomakis and Roos, by analyzing the, and I quote here, diffusion, transmission, and adopting in social movements, and they discuss it at length in their paper, which is about the different movements in Spain and Greece and in Rio, or rather what I would see as the effect of the traveling of images, ideas, and novel possibilities of public action. They could trace numerous similarities between these movements and the new inventive forms of resistance and action according to the local context. So, however, the common denominator seemed to be the spontaneity of these movements and the fact that they were leaderless, lacking a center. But in relationship to this discussion, I mean, Egyptians today are quite proud to say that they ousted through the street. It's the power of the street that ousted 2 presidents in less than 3 years. The Rebel campaign that managed to gather 22 million signatures against former President Morsi. It is true that Facebook did play a role, but that's not the truth. That's not the only reality, because they had to do a lot of face-to-face, down-to-earth and street politics by getting in through the marches and through moving around and traveling in the governorate's countryside. So back to traditional politics, face-to-face politics, by gathering signatures. And I can talk about that at length later, but I have to shift to another. So there is little doubt then that the 20 million mega city of Cairo, the city known for being one of the utmost densely populated in the world, which coincides with being one of the most deprived cities in terms of public spaces and greenery, has acquired a global attention after the January Revolution. The past 2.5 years witnessed the intensification of the conquest of spaces and urban wars over precisely these scarce public spaces, through primarily the occupation of squares to spread over almost all cities. So from squares, later war zones developed and extended to numerous streets and street fights. And this is what I'm trying to visualize, the street fights and localizing really, one massacre by zoning the protesters in a very limited space of a few meters, and this becomes then an intensified war zone, and then you create buffer walls, concrete walls, which you see later, that so that you can then squeeze protesters and harm them as much as possible and disfigure them. And we'll come back to the idea of disfiguring. That's another story in the streets. So Tahrir Square received the aligned share from the international media, quite often at the expense of minimizing the role played by various other cities like Suez, Ismailia, Alexandria, Mansoura, and the highly important working-class textile industry city of Mahal al-Kubra, which was one of the major cities that triggered the revolution, and that this is often not mentioned. And it is through the really significant demonstrations, working class demonstrations, that in 2007 had led to something like 30,000 workers demonstrating there. So, and with very violent confrontations, once again visualized and coming up on YouTube films and spread. So when confrontation between the pro-Muslim Brotherhood followers and anti-Morsi protesters escalated during the years of Morsi's government, Tahrir Square remained as the opposing space for the to the Muslim Brotherhood. After Morsi had imposed a much contested constitution that guaranteed him limitless and authoritarian powers, spectacular million marches and demonstrations occurred, this time not only in Tahrir Square, but all along the large alley of the presidential palace, in the quarter of Heliopolis, representing the symbolic space of power then. So as the scale of opposing demonstrations and marches against the Morsi regime continued to multiply and the numbers kept on growing, in the millions we're speaking, and that was already in November, not only June. November 2012. The Islamists, although being the government then, wanted to show their popularity by equally demonstrating and occupying alternative public spaces, squares. Nevertheless, in other parts of the city, in the western part and the eastern part of the city. So Tahrir is the center, east and west, the pyramids, Giza, and then the Rabaa that we sit in, which is rather in the direction of the airport, rather, I would say. I mean, this is roughly. So there, after the ousting of Morsi, the Islamists, inspired by the 18 magical days of Tahrir, created an independent walled or barricaded city in yet another square. Nevertheless, with the difference this time that the squatters carried Kalashnikovs and weapons, and we have evidence, or at least Robert Fisk is talking about him being received with the Kalashnikovs entering the sit-in of Rabaa. And in contradistinction to the Tahrir Square, there was evidence that this mini Islamic Republic of 2013, with its own police forces, which challenged the government by bringing women and children as human shields from orphanages, was partly turning into a torture camp. So the 6-week site, which ended in a bloody killing or massacre, it is a massacre, we have to state it, described by one journalist, an interesting journalist, Wael Nawara, he calls it the parallel state, the sprawling town, because it was a fight on daily basis on how many kilometers they would be then conquering the space against the police forces that were around. The sprawling town, the city-state that kept on growing day after day. And Beltrou, who is a very reliable journalist, referred to the Amnesty International report based on research on morgues. This is how you get the information about death and torture, stating that 5 corpses that were clearly tortured were found near both camps. And there is another YouTube, and this is the official, the government is stating that they found 10 corpses under a stage, and revealing that they were also tortured and tortured to death. Egyptians are entering the 3rd year of a much contested, however closely observed by the Minute Revolution on a planetary scale. And I think when I'm saying that it's an interesting moment because you're getting Tahrir in your living room through television, and also the way we would be trying to be moving in the town would be through getting the information on how to move through either television, Twitter, Facebook, or so it's a very new way then of sensory way and way of moving all around in the city. However, the ascension to power of the Muslim Brotherhood by Morsi becoming president after a highly contested military junta rule has been perceived by many as an obvious hijack of the revolution. So, and the transition has been already clearly problematic regarding the blatant violation of human rights, which immediately intensified after the ousting of Mubarak. So under the reign of the Muslim Brotherhood, and before them the military, Egypt witnessed during the past years horrifying moment of systematic killings, kidnapping, humiliating, denuding, dragging, beating to death. And you see it all on television. It's all reported on the spot on television because everything is filmed. And there is an incredible competition by satellite televisions which angle would you be on, from which angle would you be filming all that what is happening. Same thing about the marches. It's most fascinating thing is to see how the marches in Egypt have been improving, have been becoming more sophisticated and filmed, constant filming around. So, and lynching. And I want to come back to the idea because only the past 6 months during Morsi's time, there have been 50 cases of lynching, public lynching, in his governorate, the governorate where his birthplace. And there's something of, it entails a very Middle Ages feeling of voyeurism that people are in a way enjoying doing that, and it's due to the fact that there is a complete absence of police forces. So people have to take their own rights by their hands And doing that has to be, by doing it in a public way, so that, of course, it's a lesson that nobody repeats it, but then the visual, it's a very, it's a very, very graphic images that you get then in the media, people being hanged, burnt, lynched, crucified, and that is part again of that, a new form of visuality. So Cairo then witnessed multiplying million marches, demonstrations, violent clashes between protesters on the one hand and police forces, and paid thugs. And the thugs are a very important element. I would say they are the doppelgangers of the internal security, and they appear all the time in demonstrations. They are the ones, the professional rapists. They are the ones who have been mutilating and raping women. And during the reign of Morsi, was the highest really number of women being raped on Tahrir, and of course to intimidate them. So it's a whole institution, the way also they attack and isolate women and then rape them. And Cairo also witnessed the intensive urban wars and the erection of these walls, which you will see then, these walls that then were painted by graffiti, that makes, as buffer zones, that makes life really impossible for Cairenes. It makes traffic impossible. It makes daily life, because your own street is divided up into two, so you can't just, you just have to do detours of 1 hour just to cross, go on the other side of the city. And that idea of making life impossible, I think, is an intentional aim of the government. And of course, all sorts of jokes about that Egyptians are getting, very sportive and acrobats in climbing all the walls that are, and there are lots of interesting young people producing art and music about these walls, the graffiti painting, and stories about, again, daily life. So the walls, fences, and buildings, bridges, and empty public spaces of the city were transformed into a playground for graffiti, as well as for displaying insults against the regime and for biting insolent jokes. And the graffiti gets erased on basically sometimes daily basis, because the insults are really very humiliating for the military, very humiliating for the military junta. And there is a whole then, if you want to, public of urban warriors, graffiti, kids who know how to paint in the night, when to paint, and so on. And fantastic, if you want to, artistic production, which has been, of course, picked up internationally. And my theory is that there is a commodification now going out now in the arts, and these graffiti painters are becoming, of course, the rising stars that are having great acknowledgement now all over the world, and also an interesting lots of publications on. But as I said, the reading is that some of the images you see here are taken in one and the same day, where you will see that you have the kids being, throwing stones and snipers on top of the roofs, and the graffiti painters at the end of the street continuing to paint, and as one way of solidarizing with the war zone happening. So the occupation of Tahrir Square meant that a new discourse about reclaiming public spaces, as well as a new way of moving around the city, marching, running from lethal police attacks, through attacking police forces and hired thugs, and of observing and filming others. And also, spending, some of them, you have young people spending time just filming the housewives on balconies. The reaction of housewives on balconies when the marchers are passing. And you have hilarious, for instance, films on that. And not to speak of a very important group of young Egyptians who decided to create a kind of it's not an association, but a group of just to film on the spot, being in the street on the spot. Once again, marching in the city while chanting slogans, displaying protest symbols are all fascinating, And even the interesting usage of two Arabic words, which is running and moving fast, you know, karru far, it's running and moving back. So it's as if Egyptians are developing, you know, a new intensification of the mental stimulation a la Georg Simmel, you know, that you have a new way of moving in the city that is in the making. And therefore, I just want to transmit the discourse that is taking place now. Some architects argue that this is, again, a novel way of reclaiming the city. The right to the city is being mentioned all the time. Henri Lefebvre's right to the city, which is very much, you have two camps, definitely. Some saying that this is, we are witnessing empowerment, democratization. And, of course, the opposite camp saying, no, this is now really not the case. So it's a very controversial discussion, and both argue. I will mention that later, why this is the case for those supporting the right to the city. But if then applied to the Cairean context, what could be read as a turning point, as a fascinating, unique historical moment through which the power of the street has been dictating new rules of the game and new ways of occupying public spaces. Or is it, and of course the counter argument is that Cairo is entering and escalating an extremely violent phase and descending into the circle of hell. So there are, for instance, we take for instance the example of the growing communal initiatives in poor areas to find solutions to material problems. So the case of a quarter called Underdeliver, for instance, residents built a ramp out of garbage for pedestrians to avoid the multiplying deadly car accidents that kept on occurring due to the gigantic ring road that cuts across so many informal settlements, without taking into consideration the simple fact of the inhabitants' inability to cross the road without endangering their lives. So it is, and you have quite a few of such initiatives of people taking over their problems in their hands and trying to find solutions in a situation of an absent state, no state. It's important, though, to note that such grassroots initiatives were inspired by what happened during the 80 Magical Days, the idea of, once again, the creation of popular committees that defended in January the quarters, where you had youth and men getting together defending the quarters by also getting sticks and knives and weapons. It could be read as something positive. It could be read as something completely dangerous, because this is the creation of new militias. And due to the fact that now, I mean, practically I know so many people who have weapons, carry weapons all over the place. And there have been cases of militias attacking in exactly the moments, the last few months. It's a very tricky, a very open question. One point is evident, namely that with the growing absence of police forces to regulate everyday life, Cairo witnessed more than ever the obvious negative effects of the process of neoliberalism, which we discussed today a lot in the past few days, which Asif Bayat, I think Asif Bayat is a very interesting Iranian sociologist he was my colleague at the American University and who's done interesting research comparing Iran to Egypt, and analyzed in his article Politics of the City Inside Out, where he uses a lot of Castells, whereby the increasing deregulation due to the retreat of the state in public service is accompanied by a growing privatization of collective consumption and the urban spaces. So Bayat looks at how the neoliberal city has been affecting the life world, and I think life world is the right expression, and public spaces of the poor, who precisely because of the lack of public space and absence of public services end up living, interacting, and working in the street. In that scenario, it is the informal sector that becomes a dominant mode of living due to the fragmentation of labor and once again the privatization of numerous infrastructural sectors such as water, electricity, education, transport, and the privatization of space through gated communities, condominium, and walled cities, which is, again, very fashionable in Egypt. And this is where the new rich have decided to live, and it's a typically reproduced model that you see in many countries in Southeast Asia, and it's has been applied in Egypt to avoid definitely the question of slums and the 65% of Cairenes living in slums. So the phenomenon of neoliberalizing Cairo has actually started for now at least two decades. So whether or not the neoliberal city as a model did contribute in the fostering of the Arab Spring is once again an argument very much debated among social scientists today. But one point is that I think what we need to take out of that is that we have the number of 180 million Arabs in the Middle East are living on the informal sector, surviving through the informal sector. So, and what is of interest for us now today is that it's precisely after January 2011 that we see an imposing presence of a huge number of marginalized population that managed to quasi-permanently occupy and squat the public spaces. It's not only Tahrir, it's not only revolutionaries. There is a whole life related to Tahrir that has to do with the poor, the prostitutes, street children, who are very important, played a huge role in the revolution, being for both or against paid from both sides. And Chinese, the role of Chinese ambulant saleswomen, that's another very interesting phenomenon, selling iPhones and so on. 1 million refugees, Syrian refugees in Egypt today, in Cairo. This is a number but this is a number that has been given by the press. So you have this huge floating population that is permanently in the streets and in the center of town. Around, and I'm saying quasi-squatting because it's a constant war of attacks and retreat attacks, the police attacking, cleaning up the area violently and then people returning back. So, and so it's not only, I mean, what's important is not only did the public visibility of the street children and prostitutes and the so-called riffraff, I mean, there is a whole discourse about these riffraff that you have to do something, you have to clean the city of. Even among leftist intellectuals, this is, you know, the city is dirty, you have to clean them up. So, but what's interesting is that it transformed completely the geography of the downtown center. It transformed the geography of also mobility of cars, and rendering also circulation impossible. So it's the way up to you how you see it. It's an interesting, you can now flaneur in the center, and street vendors then have been in constant struggle to gain few meters, you know, there are architects only working on the techniques of the movable, items they are selling. It's a whole technique which is very interesting. They have pillars, they have wooden, and it has to be light to move and run quickly. And there is a whole system of then middleman, how to put it aside in the night and return back and so on. So is it that, and the question is, is it that the street is turning into a highly chaotic, uncontrollable space, playground for criminal mafiosi rule, because you have a huge mafia that has been, of course, that was already there, but today is the heyday of that chaotic situation. But then that Cairo is chaotic is no news. We all know that, you know, it's, but whether the post-revolution state of extreme anarchy is inventive through fostering even more informalized markets, it remains a contested issue. It is very inventive art-wise in terms of artistic expression is fascinating what's going on. And just to bring an example of also performances, public performances, when former Minister of Culture during Morsi's regime, the Islamist Minister of Culture, decided to ban ballet, we then had people performing dancing in the streets, Zorba the Greek, for instance, just as a way of challenging. And you have constantly young people deciding to create huge puppet shows where they make fun of the military or the Islamists and move around in the city or dance, you know. I move to the next point, which is the decentering of the urban war zones. If the first year witnessed fights taking place in the center, the Tahrir, the epicenter of the events, the center of town, and really the entrance of the modern city of Cairo, the Belle Epoque Osmanian modern city of boulevards. Cairo then witnessed the year after a decentering of war zones through the idea of, again, zoning, squeezing protesters on the one hand, but due to other political reasons, which are very difficult to explain here because it's a long, the decentering ended up in various other quarters of Cairo. So the slicing. So on the one hand, we witness a slicing of the center, a zoning of the center, and still clashes happening in the center of Tahrir in 2011, 2012. But then clashes were witnessed in various other quarters, like Abaza, where 2,096 injured and a few people killed. Maspero, the massacre of Maspero, this is where the army crushed the Copts, and some 24 people with tanks, and some 24 people were killed. And then clashes around the American Embassy and Garden City and the Simon Bolivar Square, which led to other more walls being created. And then clashes in front of the High Court of Justice, clashes and attacks of the Israeli embassy at the quarter of Giza, causing even more deaths. Clashes took in front of the Ministry of Defense again in Abaza once again when the Salafis went to demonstration there. And then the spectacular demonstrations that took place in November and December 2012 all around the city, but most importantly, the ones that took place at the presidential palaces, ended up in a very dramatic way, because this was the first time that the Muslim Brothers openly sent militias to kill the protesters and set up torture chambers. And then we had a qualitative level of violence and public display of violence that was marking. And I think that was the symbolic move to the downfall of Morsi. And all this then once again documented through YouTube films and spreading information. Through once again that group of young people who are called, we are insistent, Musirun, insisting on continuing to film the events and put them on YouTube. So, and then the recent incidents in April of the main Coptic Cathedral, which was attacked during the funeral of the 4 victims of a sectarian strife in the governorate of Kalubaya. So, so first the mourners were attacked by stones, and then gunmen and policemen fired back. So, and once again, I think it's just when you see that decentering, you can imagine what kind of chaos this produces in the city, in terms of mobility and in terms of moving around. I now move to another point, which is repetitive dystopias, the Vision Cairo 2050, because this was the master plan that was supposed to be transforming Cairo into a global city. And so before January 2011, Cairo 2050 was a visionary master plan that proposed by the government, and it carried the ambition of reinventing Cairo to an upgraded, again, everybody speaks and likes to say, global city. And the grandiose futuristic plan imagined Cairo with upscale large avenues, green spaces, highways, and skyscrapers. And when you see the maquette, is fascinating science fiction, of course, non-Cairo, but this is what they dream of. So, and several architects and urban planners quickly criticized the plan for the reason that even if it addressed the acute ecological problems, pollution, lack of greenery, in the end effect, the solutions proposed appeared to be like an emulation of a dystopian Dubai. And once again, Dubai as a model is very much discussed, if you want to, paradigm that the Mubarak elite wanted to reproduce and emulate. That doesn't work, of course, but Dubai means that you clean up poor areas, the slums, by evicting people and creating the shopping centers, skyscrapers, and And so this is definitely, it's an unrealistic plan for Cairo, which most important challenges, the challenge is the endlessly sprawling informal settlements and slums. So that shock the viewer through flagrant inequalities and aesthetics, definitely between the haves and the have-nots. But, and of course we have to, I mean, we have a problem defining what slums are, and we can talk about that later, because it's not really slums in the understanding of slums or favelas in the Latin American sense. So the original plan was to move out of the city then 10 to 12 million residents to the satellite cities in order that by 2050 the decrease of the population from the informal settlements would be decreased from 50% to 15%. So the applicability of the plan was questioned because it ignored the local demands, definitely, of the poor. And it was also criticized by the architects who really even designed that plan. They realized that considering the fact that we have such an intelligent government, that would have been really fatal. Even for the government, you would have created huge riots. So the 2011 report of the United Nations Human Settlements Program states that Cairo's informal settlements comprise 8 to 10 million Cairenes. I think it's more, who live and thrive under live under the informality. The encroachment, and this is the term which Asif Bayat uses constantly, or rather the class confrontation has already started in several quarters of Cairo. One of the most recent incidents occurred in the quarter of Ramlet Moula, which has been transformed during the past decades into a strikingly divided space. The numerous erected luxurious towers are mushrooming along the Nile Corniche, just opposite to the poor low-income residents, who were pushed away by the invasion of rich investors to make out of that area. So and then clashes started when in September 2012, a resident of the quarter was killed by the security guards of the Nile Towers after a fight occurred between the residents. The resident was not paid for temporary work he was assigned to do. So the clash led to several residents attempting to attack the building, which resulted into a massive and violent interference into the quarter from police forces. Another violent incident followed when, on the 27th of June, a fire took place in the quarter and the security guards refused to provide water, resulting into another storming of the towers by the local residents. So the fire led to the death of a child, and the Sawiris Orascom family, which is one of the most important tycoon families who built these towers, is perceived by the residents as their main threat, since the police, through the governorate's consent, has started evicting the residents. So since revolutions seem to be all about long-term processes, many believe that the 18 magical days were just the beginning of a long process, incomplete, and it is true that the Pandora's box has been finally opened through ousting a dictator, two dictators if you want to. But it is true that Pandora's box has been, many then believe that a larger scale French Revolution style is yet to come, because precisely the unresolved problem of, once again, the polarized Cairo, city of Cairo. And it's the argument that it will be the hunger, the next step is the hunger revolution. The revolution of the starving. So the slum dwellers, that is, or the rebellion of the underdogs. But this is, again, one can have a double reading, because this is one way of demonizing the poor too. And this is another discourse of the elite, saying that this is anyway evident and therefore, the previous discourse was these slums or these spaces need to be eradicated like cancer, and this was the dominant discourse for long years, and drastically eradicated. But of course, they don't manage to do it. This is so how would then upper class and middle class Cairene protect themselves from the invasion of the starving, considering the fact that the borderline between slum areas and Cairene residential areas is just a few meters, in most of the quarters. And this is what the rich are afraid of. It's once again, and at the same time, according to UN Habitat report, that some 500,000 of empty units exist in Cairo. So you have an incredible shortage of housing on the one hand, and an incredible speculation on real estate that produces then millions and millions of flats that are empty in the desert. The rich have opted to move out of the center of Cairo to the outskirts and new satellite cities on the eastern and western parts of the Egyptian desert, so to escape from Cairo's pollution and endless traffic jam. The master plan proposed to repopulate the desert by offering tax incentives and encouraging real estate companies through lucrative opportunities. And the new satellite cities in the desert, fashioned around the gated communities, condominiums, and privately administered areas connected by highways that are easily accessible to Carrefour, megastores, and so on, turned to be part and parcel of the making of the Egyptianized American dream, once again the Dubai style. So I just want to say that I have no conclusion. I'm just giving you, fragmented images of the city of Cairo. And the argument is, and this is what we keep on hearing all the time, we have an incredible polarization that has been going on now because of the political life. But this polarization is also taking place and being symbolized also in the way the city is being structured, in the sense of the history of Cairo. Cairo has always been defined as a tale of two cities. One, the Islamic city versus the European Osmanized city, the city of the foreigners versus the locals, and that changed later after Nasser took over. But we speak of a city of contradictions, of dualities, of polarizations. And this polarization is even more increasing now with the fact that you have an incredible growing number of informal, I would rather use informal than slums, informal housing, versus then the gated communities, in a situation then of a completely transformed city through war zones and battlefields. So I think that's it.